Okay, and now it's time for our next presentation in the Data Protection and DR Strategy Megacast. This session comes from HYCU. Presenting for HYCU is Dave Byers, Senior Field Technologist. Dave, welcome.
Great, thank you very much. All right, so yes, I'm Dave Byers. I'm a Senior Field Technologist here at HYCU. One of the first things that I was asked to do when I came to HYCU 2 years ago was to help prepare an assessment tool, and we call that R-Score. So part of the presentation, I'm going to be talking about cloud disaster recovery, how to not make it a disaster in 2023, but I'll also share with you a little bit about R-Score, what this assessment tool actually does, but also speaking about our data management platform called Protege. So with that, let me get started. One of the things that I had done when I had built this tool, which is called R-Score, it is a ransomware assessment, we really based it upon the NIST cyber framework. To us, this is very important because we wanted to make sure that most organizations are following this when we talk about reducing cybersecurity risk. So there's basically 5 things. The identify, which is looking at systems, people, assets, and data. Then we're also looking at the protection. So it's things like identity management, access control, even awareness training for the end users. So we talk about testing the end users. So if there's a phishing attack, we want to make sure that they're well prepared and well versed on identifying things like that. And then also detection. A lot of organizations use detection tools looking for anomalies and events, looking for continuous monitoring, detection processes. And then also how to respond to that, and things like containment of cyber threats, analysis and mitigation. And then lastly is the recovery, which is about recovery planning and incident response. Now, in my slide, I've highlighted recovery because to me, that's one of the big important things that I think our end users really have to be aware of is the recovery aspect. I think a lot of people really focus on the prevention detection aspect, but when it comes to the recovery, that's where I think people have a little bit of a false belief that they can actually recover. So what do organizations think versus reality? So I think organizations believe today that, you know what, because I've got a disaster recovery plan, I do practice it, that I can successfully recover. Well, that's simply not the case. I think that when I talk to organizations, when I do these assessments, I found out that they do have disaster recovery plans, but they might not be well documented. They might not do any kind of cross-training with end users, which they need to. And then lastly, when I talk to people about incident response drills, and they typically say, well, what is an incident response drill? I have no idea what that is. I'm like, well, it's like a disaster recovery plan, but is really meant for cybersecurity threats. So we need to take a look at how to actually build those incident response plans. In this assessment that I do, it's quite extensive, and we ask a lot of questions to help prepare those end users in those organizations to make sure that we plug any holes and gaps. And it's things like, you know, what does my backup process look like? What does my security policies look like? When I do a recovery, what does that look like? Do I have change management? Do I do audits? So I ask a lot of questions. And then when I talk to C-level people, the one question I ask is, well, how do I assess within your organization for you to tell me how prepared are you to actually recover from a ransomware threat? And they say, well, I've got to ask my backup administrator, my administrators that manage my physical servers, my virtual servers, my cloud environment. I might have to reach out to my cybersecurity team, my internal auditors, and they really have no way to find that out. Well, with R-Score, we actually provide you with an objective score. It's like a credit score, 0 to 1,000. And the higher the score, the better prepared you are to recover from a ransomware threat. So we really kind of focus on the recovery piece, and that's what we're doing with R-Score. Now, I know I don't have to really read a lot of this because you realize that one of the biggest attack surfaces you have are phishing attacks. I would say it's 90+ percentile of any kind of threats that come inside of an organization tend to start with some kind of a phishing attack. And once that attack begins, then you have to look at things like suspicious changes to files or file name locations, unauthorized access to data. It might be undetected extraction of data, which you have to worry about for extortion purposes. You might look at things like file encryption, which you might have your own applications or backup applications performing encryption, but you need to look outside the box and see what else might be trying to do encryption that I am not calling upon. It might be looking for suspicious login attempts, and then also Active Directory domain controllers can be attacked, as well as security software, such as HYCU. And then also responding to known threats. So based on those NIST standards, the identification, protection, detection, how we respond to that, remediation of analysis. We also have things like tactical recovery, strategic recovery. So all of these things we have to follow along in developing these plans to make sure we're well prepared for those cyber threats. And each one of these are not done serially. This is a constant thing that has to be done within organizations. So anytime that I'm doing any kind of documentation, audits, testing, validation, it's really something that you want to practice all the time. You know, whether it be quarterly, twice a year, or once a year, but it has to be done. So as I talked, most companies that I speak to, when I say, let's talk about doing this assessment, they said, well, listen, I already have my prevention tools in place. I might have firewalls, port restrictions, server access. I use multi-factor authentication. I test my users for any kind of internal phishing attacks. They also tell me, well, listen, I already have my detection tools in place. So it might be a third-party tool. It might be a custom homegrown tool that's actually doing detection, looking for anomalous behavior. It might be using artificial intelligence. But what I'm amazed at is when I get to the recovery aspect and I'm asking people about the recovery side, that's where they stumble a little bit and they say, well, I have to ask a lot of people to make sure we can recover. And yes, they're going to say, yes, we do disaster recovery. We practice it. But I say, well, let's talk about incident response. That is a little bit different. It's really all about that recovery. So as I said, you know, we're using script third-party applications. That's what I think of a lot of organizations focus on. Restricting port access to making sure that people don't have access to certain things, especially someone coming from the outside. But what I see, like I said, CEOs kind of lack the confidence today, especially when I talk to them about the recoverability. And can they actually do that? And do they test it? And do they validate? And some organizations are really not prepared to do disaster recovery tests every quarter. And they feel uncomfortable because it's overwhelming. Well, now we add to that the incident response layer as well. However, it's really good for organizations to do this because I, at one time, was a sysadmin, and I was always worried on Friday nights, am I going to get a nice weekend or be able to sleep throughout the weekend to make sure these things are not going to break, and I have to go in on a weekend or log in during the weekend and actually fix certain things. I want to make sure I've got a good night's sleep. I think administrators want that same thing. They want to make sure that they are prepared for disaster recovery events as well as cyber threats. And when I talked about R-score, I mentioned that before. It is an assessment. It will sometimes take me 2 to 3 hours to actually get through that assessment with someone. There's 100 questions. It's over 5 different categories. What actually gets generated is a PDF document that shows all the questions that I asked, all the answers that were prepared, and then also feedback for every single possible answer that is given. We have individualized custom feedback that goes with that. And then also I sit down, I do a detailed assessment. So there's a secondary document that goes on that talks about what are my strengths that I found in that organization, what are those weaknesses, and then what do we need to do for remediation to fix those holes. So that is our score. So ransomware recovery. So I mentioned about disaster recovery, but let's talk about the incident response, because I would say out of all the assessments that I've done, 8 out of 10 roughly either have not heard of incident response, or if they have heard of incident response, they've never practiced it. It is something that is just simply not documented. And it is very similar to disaster recovery, but it is different. We're still using the same snapshots. We're still using the same backup copies, replica copies, immutable storage copies. But where it's different is going to be on the understanding of the what, where, when, and how, which typically we don't have to answer all those questions when it comes to disaster recovery, but when it comes to an incident response, we certainly have to understand where the attack occurred, how it occurred, where it started, and we have to look at doing containment. So for me, I need to have a very robust incident response plan written up, and it's constantly modified. So as you know, data centers today, public cloud environments today, they're very dynamic and they change a lot. And I usually advise customers, I said, well, listen, when you develop these plans, they're constantly in motion, because anytime you have major changes in the environment, within the infrastructure, adding new servers, moving physical workloads to virtual, or moving a virtual workload into the cloud, then that is changing the complexity of that environment. We need to make sure that you're updating constantly those incident response plans. We also have to understand who the key players are and what their responsibilities are. We have to understand any kind of dependency change within applications. You look at an application, sometimes applications are dependent upon things like a SQL server, an Oracle server, any other database. We have to understand those dependency changes. We also have to look at tiering, different tiered levels, because once I go through either a disaster or an incident response, we have to understand where that attack took place, where it started, and then when I need to go back and how far back I need to roll back to actually begin my recovery. So there's a lot that goes involved in this, and I think that people think that because I've got disaster recovery plans, that should be good enough to recover from an incident cyber threat, but it's not. So there's a lot more that goes into it. And then we also look at adjusting communication plans. So there's a lot of communication that goes on within the organization, because when you move from a large commercial, or to an enterprise account, typically you've got a lot of different groups that are engaged at different levels that are doing different things. From my backup team, I might have the administrators that protect my virtual machines, my physical servers, my cybersecurity teams, my internal or external auditors. If I do any kind of penetration testing internally, I have to involve a lot of people. So as I'm making changes in that environment, I make changes to my documentation, I make changes to my test plans. I want to make sure I've got really good communication between all of those groups to make sure that those incident response plans are updated and they work perfectly. So HYCU Protege, this is our data management platform. If you've not heard of Protege, we've been around for about 5 years. We've received 2 rounds of funding, and one of the things that we're looking at today too is when we look at the challenges around disaster recovery in the cloud era. People not only are protecting data locally, but they now have a hybrid cloud agenda as well. So they protect data on-prem, they might have workloads in the cloud, or they simply might use that cloud to move data into outside storage, like a public cloud vendor, where they can actually utilize immutable storage. And then we have also the in-cloud. So those are people who are actually using cloud all the time, and they're not using something that's on-prem or even a hybrid cloud. And there's challenges with that too. I know when you go from on-prem into the cloud, there might be agents that are required for either the backup application itself that requires certain agents, or you have to have agents that get dropped onto applications or databases to protect those, either from a virtual or a physical. So the one thing that HYCU wanted to do is we wanted to make sure that we had built this, that it was a true SaaS application that's purpose-built for the cloud. It's going to be something that's very simple, but also that supports an on-prem, hybrid, as well as multi-cloud enablement. We also wanted to build it for self-service as well as multi-tenancy, and then also security first. So that is Protege, and that is really how we built this out. As I mentioned, we do have on-premise. Now, the one thing I liked about what HYCU does is that we are completely agentless. So from a virtual to a physical perspective, we don't require any agents to be pushed out onto any servers whatsoever. I've spent a lot of time doing data protection since 2005, and I know that when you talk to DBAs, and as soon as you say, I want to protect your workloads, the first question they're going to ask is, you're not going to put an agent on that box, are you? That's the question. So whether it be a physical server or a virtual server, there's no agents required. When we move these workloads into the cloud, the same thing. We are completely agentless when we move data into the cloud. I think one of the challenges people have today is if they're going from an on-prem solution and they want to move those workloads into the cloud, is, well, how easy is it to do that? Well, that is something that is very easy with Protege, because now I can actually take the data from an on-prem and actually do a migration into the cloud. And it's a very simple way to move those workloads in the cloud. I think a lot of people have challenges going from an on-prem into the cloud. When we talk about physical servers, the on-prem solution with physical servers, I can also migrate those physical servers into the cloud and make it a very easy experience for the end user. And then we also do multi-cloud support, completely agentless, and also migration. The one thing that we can do that's really nice with Protege is we now can actually do a migration from cloud to cloud. So if you have multi-cloud vendors that you're currently working with, whether it be Azure and AWS or AWS and GCP, I can actually move those workloads back and forth between those cloud vendors and easily within the same console. And so this is a real quick look at what we're doing with the transformation of data protection as a true SaaS solution, but we protect Nutanix, VMware, GCP, Microsoft AWS, and Microsoft 365. I do have one slide at the very end. I did not have time to actually put this in the slide deck, but we also have something now called our cloud. A lot of organizations use SaaS applications within the cloud. And it was interesting when I found this out. There's like 17,000 plus applications that are SaaS-based applications that can run in the cloud between those three vendors. One of the challenges people have is that they have the misnomer of, because it runs in the cloud, the data is protected. Well, you know what? The application is protected. The infrastructure underlying that application is protected. When it comes to the data sets, you'll usually find out those SaaS vendors will say, no, it's up to you to make sure those workloads are protected. So we now have a development platform that we open up to our cloud service providers as well as our partners and the SaaS vendors themselves, where they can actually develop on one of our APIs to actually protect those SaaS workloads in the cloud. So now we open up a marketplace, and that marketplace enables us to protect those SaaS workloads that are typically left unprotected. So I'll show one of the later slides, but you'll get to see a little brief introduction of what that actually looks like. So the seamlessly failover into the cloud. The key capabilities is that it's on-prem solution and recovery to the cloud. So we can protect those on-prem workloads, but we can easily move those workloads into the cloud, or if you simply want to use that cloud for, say, immutable storage. We want to take advantage of, say, S3 immutable storage within those cloud platforms. We have easy ways to move that data directly into the cloud. And like I mentioned, we use Google Cloud. We do Azure, AWS. We could use those for DR target sites. So when we're talking about disaster recovery, for those of you who have hybrid cloud environments, you might have a secondary data center that is off-site that you use for that DR. I think what a lot of people want to do when they talk about actually utilizing that cloud is actually utilize that cloud for a disaster recovery location. And so we actually make it a very seamless way and actually to help you move those workloads in the cloud for disaster recovery purposes. And then also we're true SaaS. So you only have to pay for the compute and storage as you need it. And some of the differentiators is that this product, Protege, was specifically designed and built for Nutanix. So for those of you who have Nutanix environments on premise, we certainly work extremely well with Nutanix. And it has the same look and feel as Nutanix. And I think it's one of the best ways to actually protect the Nutanix environment is with Protege. Something else that is a differentiator as well for us too is we also have auto detection of the virtual servers on-prem, our physical servers on-prem. And if I have workloads that run in the cloud, I also have auto discovery capabilities there also. So when we install Protege, from the very beginning to the very end, I am protecting data within 30 minutes. And because I have the auto discovery feature enabled, I can see everything within my environment, from physical to virtual. If it's application specific, I can actually see those applications themselves. The only thing that I need to do is I need to put in the credentials for those applications once I discover those, but it makes it very seamless. The other thing too is that absolutely no agents. And I think a lot of people are quite surprised when I say, you know, you can protect your physical servers on-prem. There are no agents required whatsoever. If I'm protecting an application in a cloud environment, no agents whatsoever. So we are 100% agentless completely. And then also the reporting is really unique too. So the reporting is built into it. You don't have to have a secondary tool that is not part of the primary platform. Protege also enables you to do all of your reporting built into Protege itself. There's no third party that you have to rely upon. There's no secondary application I've got to install with a SQL Server database that sits behind it. It is all part of HYCU. It just comes with it. And then also the key capabilities here, cross-regional recovery for GCP, AWS, and Azure. And I know that a lot of organizations I speak to, they don't just use one public cloud vendor. They might rely upon 1, 2, or 3 public cloud vendors. And what I like about that too is I have easy ways to move data between those cloud vendors, quite easy. And once you're in the cloud, like I said, it's 100% SaaS. It makes it very simple to stand that environment up. You simply go to the marketplace, you download HYCU Protege, and within 30 minutes, you're protecting those workloads in the cloud. And it is, since we utilize all the APIs for those clouds, it is purpose-built. Everything is cloud native. So it's a very easy way to get the environment stood up and used. Let's skip over this one. This slide, I'm sorry, actually replicates some of that. So now this will be the call to action. This will be the last slide that I share with you. So if you have any questions, I'd more than welcome them. But I've included 2 links on here. One is our HYCU webpage, the HYCU.com. The second one is the www.getarscore.org. This is kind of give you a really brief example of what the R-score assessment will look like. It is very brief. It's the same 5 categories as the larger assessment, but it's only 23 questions. So it'll only take you about 15 minutes to go through that. But this will actually give you an idea of where you might stand as far as recovery from a ransomware event. What I'm showing here on the lower left-hand side is some of the output, and this is just very brief because some of the reports I've done can be extensive. So this will show you the different sections that we have and then how they score in each of those sections. And then, like I said, it's like a FICO-like score. We present you with a final score. We eventually like to see people up into the 900s is where we'd like to see. And then lastly, on the right-hand side, so this is what our cloud actually looks like, but I know it's kind of hard, so I kind of blew it up here. But we will do the auto detection of any SaaS applications the organization might be using. So here I'm showing I've got engineering. In engineering, I have got different applications, SaaS applications that I'm actually using. You also might find like your marketing team is going to be using different applications. Your sales team might be using different SaaS applications. So we break that down into a nice GUI that you can actually drill down into. You can zoom into it. You can see what is actually being protected as my SaaS environment goes. This tool actually even tell me if a SaaS backup vendor is protecting their own data or not. So now you have visibility into what that SaaS vendor is doing or not doing with your data. So very, very nice tools that we have. And with that, I will open it up for questions. I know it went through the very fast because I can actually talk for hours on this, but I had to make it brief.
No, Dave, that was great. And yeah, let's leave this slide up here during the Q&A so people can follow those live links. But you know, I'm fascinated by this R-score. That seems like a really good tool. And one of the things that I was wondering about is, you know, I think you made a reference to being sort of like a credit score, a FICO score. You know, when you look at those subcategories there, are they relatively equally weighted, or is it like a credit score where, you know, like they more heavily weight your payment history, your available credit? You know, how does that work?
That is a fabulous question. So when we built this, I really had built this with the NIST standards in mind, but we also had feedback from Mandiant, FireEye, Boston College, and we also had some other outside third-party cybersecurity groups looking at this too to validate what we're doing is correct. Now, these scores that you're looking at, and it's not a simplistic score. Yes, you're correct. It is weighted. There are weightings that go through each of those main categories. But underneath each of those main categories, there are subsections. Those subsections then get weighted. And then the actual questions within those subcategories additionally get weighted. So there was a lot of calculations that go into this. And I tell people it is proprietary information on how we actually did this. But we had some people from Boston College that actually helped us with how to do this and how to weight it properly.
Very cool. So that's really interesting to know, like, the thought that went into it behind there as well. That's really neat.
Yeah. And I'll tell you what,
go ahead.
People have done these assessments. They some will be embarrassed because their score they thought was going to be higher than it should have been. And I said, listen, this is a good baseline to start from because now we can pinpoint where the holes in your environment are within each of these categories. So even if you have a category that shows green, we still might have some underlying issues in those areas that we have to address. So just because it's green, we don't ignore it. So the detailed report that I actually generate will actually show here's where your strengths are, here's where you're doing industry best practices, but then here's your weaknesses. We dive into those weaknesses and provide them with details on this is what you need to do to just resolve that.
Okay. Yeah, and Russell from the audience, is not a question but more a comment. He says, I like a good score mechanism, great for explaining upstream.
Yes.
You know, so really want it simplified. Yeah, awesome.
Yep.
Yeah, so you made a really strong case for having an incident response plan separate from a disaster recovery plan. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about like, what are the main things organizations miss if they just do a standard like DR plan? You know, they don't do
Well,
incident response.
that's another good question too. So when you think about disaster recovery, gosh, I'm dating myself here. I have been a sysadmin from 1995 going forward before I became a system engineer, in 2005. So I was doing a lot of work around disaster recovery with a hedge fund that I had worked for that managed billions of dollars worth of other people's assets. We had to be all the way up to 7 nines of protection because they had worked with so much money that any small amount of downtime was critical. So we had to have these super robust disaster recovery plans. So when you think about disaster recovery, and I live in the Houston area, so every spring we're always concerned about hurricanes. So we want to make sure we have those robust disaster recovery plans. But disaster recovery plans are built with the intent of either I'm going to have a planned or an unplanned outage. Whether someone deletes a file, wipes out a VM, I have a host that goes offline that drops, 5 or 10 VMs, then I need to do recovery to that. And there could be other disaster recovery that has, can take place, but I have to do recovery from that. Typically, it's going to be coming from the latest known good backup or snapshot, and that is what I'll do is I will try and pull the data in from that. Now, with an incident response, it's different because you might not be able to rely on that data. I might not be able to rely on that snapshot or backup because, well, it might be encrypted. It might contain malware. So there has to be forensics. One of the things that you're not doing with recovery plan or disaster recovery plans is you don't have to worry about any kind of forensics unless it's, a major outage. But typically you don't have to do the who, what, where, why. You just simply have to know, when was that fire? I need to go back to the latest date. In an incident response plan, I have to do a lot of forensics to figure out when I can go back and how far back to actually recover to a specific point to where that malware did not exist. And then how deep did they actually penetrate into my environment? So incident response addresses a lot of those things. And unfortunately, like I said, 8 out of 10 people I speak to do not know about it. But now that they've gone through the assessment, they're like, thank goodness we spoke because now I know about it and now I know what to do. I actually have links that will actually show you, well, here's 4 different incident response plans you can choose from. Pick the one that is most suitable for your environment, and that's going to give you a good starting point. We also do what's called like an R-score audit. That audit then will go through, we just did with R-score, and that R-score audit will then say, well, let's take a look at all your weaknesses. We'll address those. We'll make sure we audit those in this audit tool. And then from that tool, we're going to go on and say, okay, now let's go ahead and retake our score 6 months from now because we made major changes, major improvements. And I like this too because people say, well, hey, I don't have to worry about any kind of guarantee because now I've plugged all the holes. I don't want to have a piece of software that might say of this guarantee. We can make sure you're going to get your data back. They appreciate this tool because now they have a way to look at that environment and find a way to actually repair some of the holes that they might have. And it can be even processes because I address things on process controls, change management, internal and external auditors, penetration testing. So there's a lot of things I talk about during this assessment to help people get ready. And then obviously with HYCU, and I've got this really robust tool and very simple to use to actually be able to get to that point to recovery.
Gotcha.
Good question.
Yeah, no, great clarification. I really appreciate it. And I did throw up the poll here, just for additional information people would like from HYCU. So yeah, we'll just leave that up here for a minute. And I did want to call out one thing that you mentioned. You said 7 nines of availability, which is like what, 3 seconds per year?
Way out.
That's
insane. When you deal with billions of dollars worth of money, when you say I've got a minute of downtime, you know how much money that just costs the business? It's a lot.
Yeah.
So we had to be that far out.
Dave, unfortunately, we're just about up on time, but
Okay.
Do you have any sort of maybe a high-level best practice to leave people with, or just a recommendation as far as getting started with HYCU?
So for me, the best practice is, always have good verified backups that you practice and you schedule those. That is one of the things that I see people that they do not do. They don't have these things that are scheduled. So when I do these assessments, that's what I'm seeing. I also want to make sure people are following the 3-2-1 or 3-2-1-1-0 rule. I want to make sure that people have those 3 copies of the data. 2 of them are in different types of media, and 1 is always off-site. 1 is going to be immutable, 0 errors. So as long as people are practicing those good rules, That is the very basics of it. But when you go through a HYCU R score, that's where I really get into the meat of what we need to do across those 5 different segments and how we can actually get them to a certain place. Internally here at HYCU, if you're using HYCU, we also have disaster recovery plans that are already drawn up and ready to go that we can actually share with people, whether it be an on-prem hybrid or a cloud solution for incident response and disaster recovery. So, yeah, all good stuff.
Excellent. All right, well, Dave, thanks so much for being here. Really appreciate the update on HYCU and great presentation.
Sure. Great. Thanks again.